My name is Catherine and I am 34 years old. My stepson thought I was just a useless burden draining his father's bank account. He had absolutely no idea I was a retired federal judge bringing in $36,000 a month, or that I owned the very debt keeping a roof over his head. When my husband insisted we spend Christmas with his family, I deliberately wore my oldest, most threadbare coat. I wanted to see exactly how they treated a nobody. Then, right in the middle of dinner, my stepson quietly slid a thick manila envelope across the mahogany table. 3 minutes later, I unleashed a legal and financial nightmare that stripped them of everything they owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to play the fool to expose the villains hiding in your own family. The Christmas dinner at my husband Richard's estate was designed to be intimidating. Richard was 48, a man who built his entire identity on the fragile illusion of wealth. The grand dining room was a sprawling space featuring a massive mahogany table set with crystal goblets, sterling silver flatware, and a centerpiece of imported winter roses. Yet despite the aggressive display of luxury, the thermostat was set to a chilling 65 degrees. Richard liked it cold and nobody was allowed to adjust it. I sat near the end of the table, wrapped tightly in a frayed, oversized wool coat I had picked up at a thrift store the day before. The cuffs were pilling, and one of the large front buttons was barely hanging on by a single thread. I wore it purposefully, keeping it on through the appetizers and straight into the main course. Beatrice, Richard's 45-year-old sister, could not take her eyes off it. She sat across from me, sipping her red wine, her face a mask of poorly concealed disgust. She wore a designer silk blouse and a thick diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light from the chandelier above us. "Catherine, are we keeping you from a soup kitchen shift later tonight?" Beatrice asked, her voice ringing out clearly over the soft holiday music playing in the background. "Because that coat looks like you literally pulled it out of a dumpster behind a discount mall. We have a coat closet, you know. Or did you just want to make sure everyone here knows how much Richard has to provide for you?" Laughter rippled around the table. It was not gentle, good-natured laughter. It was the sharp, cruel sound of wealthy people finding entertainment in someone they deemed entirely beneath them. I kept my face completely neutral, cutting a small piece of turkey on my porcelain plate. I wanted them to feel comfortable, to feel completely secure in their arrogant assumptions. Beside Beatrice sat her husband, Andre. He was 46, a highly successful African-American corporate lawyer who never let anyone forget his credentials. Andre adjusted his platinum Rolex, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He was a man who believed his law degree made him a god among men, and he looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute contempt. "You have to forgive her," Beatrice, Andre said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute authority. "Richard has always had a soft spot for charity cases. It is just a shame she insists on ruining the holiday aesthetic for the rest of us. Catherine, sweetheart, if you are that cold, maybe you should try generating some actual body heat by getting a job." I looked down the table at Richard. My husband of 3 years was carving his roast, a smug smirk playing on his lips. I waited for him to defend me, to remind his family that I was his wife. He did not rush to my defense. He did not tell his brother-in-law to show some respect. Instead, he chuckled, pointing his silver carving knife in my direction. "Now do not be too hard on Katie, Richard," said his tone dripping with condescension. "She has had a rough time lately. Finding employment is difficult when your resume is completely blank. Just take a joke, Katie. Andre is only teasing you." "I am not sensitive, Richard," I replied, my voice calm and measured. "I am just trying to understand the definition of charity in this house." Brandon, Richard's 24-year-old son, let out a loud scoff from the seat next to me. Brandon was the epitome of unearned entitlement. He wore a tailored cashmere sweater paid for by his father and drove a sports car he could never afford on his own. "Charity means living in a multi-million-dollar estate and eating food you did not pay for," Brandon snapped, glaring at me. "You contribute nothing to this family. You just take." I slowly placed my fork down, turning my gaze directly to Brandon. "That is an interesting perspective, Brandon. Especially since exactly 1 year ago, your father forced me to sell my mother's antique heirloom piano. He said we needed liquid cash for an emergency. It turned out the emergency was funding your brilliant tech startup." I watched Brandon's jaw clench as I continued, making sure the entire table heard every word. "Tell me, how is that startup doing? The one that burned through $30,000 in exactly 1 week before you abandoned it to go partying in Cabo." If we are calculating who takes what in this family, I suggest you look in the mirror. Beatrice gasped dramatically. Andre narrowed his eyes, clearly displeased that the quiet, submissive wife was suddenly biting back with specific financial details. Richard slammed his heavy hand on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. That is enough, Catherine. Richard barked, his face turning an angry shade of red. You are completely out of line. Brandon's business ventures are an investment in the family legacy. The sale of that piano was a necessary marital sacrifice. You do not understand high-level finances, so keep your mouth shut and eat your dinner. I did not flinch at his shouting. I simply picked up my fork again and took another bite of my dinner. The trap was set perfectly. They were agitated, their fragile egos were bruised, and their true colors were completely on display. They thought they were dealing with a helpless, unemployed woman who had no choice but to absorb their verbal abuse. They were so confident in their financial superiority that they did not even bother to hide their contempt. Brandon pushed his plate away, leaving his meal half-eaten. He wiped his mouth aggressively with a linen napkin and stood up from his chair. The festive atmosphere of the room had completely evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. He reached inside the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He did not hand it to me gently. He threw it. The heavy package landed dead center on my porcelain plate with a loud smack. A wave of dark brown gravy splashed violently across the white tablecloth, staining the pristine fabric and dotting the sleeve of my frayed wool coat. Nobody gasped. Nobody apologized for the mess. Beatrice leaned forward with a hungry, expectant smile. Andre crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair like a judge presiding over a courtroom. Richard just stared at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any affection. What is this? I asked, looking at the gravy-stained envelope. Brandon leaned over me, placing both hands on the table, invading my personal space. His breath smelled of expensive bourbon and pure malice. That is your reality check, Brandon whispered harshly. Open it. I reached out and wiped a streak of brown gravy from the thick manila envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, and carried the distinct sterile smell of a high-end law office. I did not rush. I peeled back the metal clasp with deliberate slowness and pulled out a stack of crisp white pages. The bold black font at the top of the very first page screamed its intention. Post-nuptial agreement and total marital asset waiver. I scanned the first paragraph, my eyes taking in the dense, aggressive legalese. It was an absolute, unconditional surrender. According to this document, I was agreeing to relinquish every single legal right I possessed as a spouse under state law. I would forfeit all claims to the equity in the multi-million-dollar estate we lived in. I would waive any right to future spousal support or alimony. I would surrender any claim to Richard's retirement accounts, his investment portfolios, and his business assets. In exchange for signing away my entire legal existence in this marriage, I was being offered a lump sum buyout of exactly $5,000. $5,000. That was the precise numerical value they had placed on my dignity. I looked up from the stapled pages. Brandon was practically vibrating with arrogant energy. He leaned heavily against the mahogany table, glaring down at me, like I was an infestation he was finally exterminating. We are not running a homeless shelter for unemployed gold diggers. Brandon sneered, his voice loud enough to echo off the vaulted dining room ceiling. You have been riding my father's coattails for 3 years. You sit around this house all day, drinking his coffee, eating his food, and contributing absolutely nothing to the bottom line. It ends tonight. You sign those papers, you take your little $5,000 relocation fee, and you get out of our lives. I kept my face completely blank. You talk about contributing to the bottom line, Brandon, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. That is a bold statement from someone who maxed out 3 different credit cards last summer to rent private yachts in Miami, all paid off quietly by your father. Are those the financial contributions you are referring to? Brandon's face flushed a furious, ugly red. Do not you dare try to flip this on me, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. You are a parasite. You bring zero income into this house. You are nothing but a financial drain. Beatrice let out a sharp, theatrical laugh from across the table. $5,000 is incredibly generous, she chimed in, swirling the dark red wine in her crystal glass. Honestly, Brandon, you are far too kind to her. With her complete lack of marketable skills, she should be paying you for the privilege of having slept under a luxury roof all this time. Take the money, Catherine. It will probably cover a security deposit on a nice, modest apartment in a bad neighborhood. Andre, sitting right beside his wife, chuckled in deep agreement. As an African American corporate attorney who prided himself on destroying people in ruthless boardrooms, Andre loved the sight of a completely one-sided oppressive contract. He smoothed the lapels of his custom Tom Ford suit and offered me a highly condescending smile. It is a standard severance package for a non-performing asset, Catherine, Andre said, using his booming, authoritative courtroom voice. He adjusted his platinum Rolex, making sure it caught the light. I suggest you take the deal. If you try to drag this into litigation, I will personally make sure you end up owing us thousands in court fees. You do not have the resources to fight this family. I did not react to Andre's hollow threats. I did not react to Beatrice's venom or Brandon's explosive tantrums. My eyes shifted slowly down the length of the table, bypassing the expensive winter roses and the silver platters, landing directly on the man sitting at the head of it. Richard, my husband. The man who had stood at an altar with me and promised partnership and protection. The man who just last month forced me to cancel my much-needed physical therapy appointments because he insisted I stay home to coordinate the landscaping crew for his upcoming golf party. Richard was entirely focused on his smartphone. He was actively scrolling through emails, completely unbothered by the fact that his adult son was currently trying to financially execute his wife in the middle of Christmas dinner. I sat in my frayed thrift store coat, feeling the chill of the dining room sink deep into my bones. This was the defining moment. This was the exact fork in the road where a husband either stepped up to shield his partner from a vicious, orchestrated family attack or stepped aside to let the wolves tear her apart. Richard, I said quietly, my voice slicing clearly through the tense, suffocating silence of the room. I kept my tone perfectly level, devoid of any tears or desperation. Your son just handed me a legal document attempting to evict me from my own marriage. Are you going to say something to him? Brandon crossed his arms, wearing a triumphant, mocking smirk. Beatrice took another long sip of her wine, watching the show with pure delight. Andre leaned back, waiting for the final nail in my coffin. I waited for Richard to put his phone down. I waited for him to look at me, to recognize the woman he supposedly loved, and to put an immediate stop to this highly orchestrated humiliation. Richard finally tapped his thumb against his phone screen, sending an email. He picked up his sterling silver carving knife and casually sliced a small piece of turkey. He did not look up at me. He did not even look at his son. Just sign it, Katie, Richard said, his voice completely hollow and devoid of any emotion. You do not bring in any money anyway. Brandon is just protecting the family legacy. I stared at the man sitting at the head of the table. Richard looked completely at ease, his silver-streaked hair perfectly styled, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. The betrayal did not arrive with a shout or a dramatic gesture. It arrived in the casual, indifferent way he sliced his meat while effectively throwing his wife out onto the street. He did not even have the basic decency to look me in the eye while helping his son execute this financial ambush. Protecting the legacy, I repeated softly, making sure my voice carried over the instrumental holiday music playing from the hidden surround sound speakers. That is a fascinating choice of words, Richard. Is that what we are calling your behavior now? I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on my lap, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me tremble. Protecting the legacy. Like when you made me cancel my physical therapy appointments last month because Brandon needed my car for a weekend ski trip. Or perhaps it is like the time you asked me to quietly pawn the diamond earrings you gave me for our first anniversary, just so you could cover the contractor fees for your new pool house without alerting your accountant. The clinking of silverware stopped entirely. Richard froze a piece of meat suspended halfway to his mouth. He slowly lowered his fork, placing it deliberately on his porcelain plate. The easy, dismissive smirk vanished from his handsome face, replaced instantly by a dark, calculated look that I knew all too well. This was his favorite, most predictable tactic. Whenever he was backed into a corner with the undeniable truth, he immediately deflected by attacking my sanity. It was a strategy he had perfected over the 3 years of our marriage. Catherine, you are having another one of your episodes, Richard said, his voice dripping with weaponized concern. He looked around the table at his sister Beatrice and her husband Andre, playing the role of the exhausted, long-suffering husband to absolute perfection. She gets like this when her anxiety acts up. She starts inventing these wild, paranoid scenarios to make herself the victim. It is truly tragic to watch. He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes cold, empty, and completely unyielding. You are mentally unstable, Katie. I have tried to be so patient with you. I rescued you from that cramped, pathetic little life you were living before we met. I gave you a luxury roof over your head, gourmet food on your table, and a lifestyle you could never have achieved on your own. You came into this marriage with absolutely nothing to your name, and instead of being incredibly grateful for my generosity, you sit here making up vicious delusional lies about my son and my personal finances. It is embarrassing, frankly. Beatrice set her wine glass down with a sharp clink and began to clap slowly. The rhythmic sound of her palms striking together echoed loudly and mockingly in the grand dining room. "Bravo, Richard," Beatrice said, shaking her head in a display of theatrical sympathy. "Honestly, I do not know how you have endured this situation for 3 years. Your patience with this absolute leech is nothing short of saintly. If I were in your shoes, I would have packed her bags months ago." Beatrice leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You are wildly ungrateful, Catherine. You are a completely useless addition to this family. Richard has bent over backward to accommodate your endless need for financial support, and this is how you repay him. By throwing a pathetic tantrum at Christmas dinner just because Brandon finally had the courage to put a stop to your free ride. You are not a partner in this marriage. You are a dependent, and your free trial period has officially expired tonight." Andre nodded slowly in agreement, his expensive suit catching the light as he shifted in his chair. He looked at me with the smug satisfaction of a predator cornering wounded prey. "Listen to your husband," Catherine. Andre chimed in, his deep voice filling the room with arrogant authority. "Mental instability is a terrible thing, but denial will only make this legal process much harder on you. The easiest way out of this room is to accept reality. Take the generous severance package we are offering, and walk away quietly before you humiliate yourself further." Brandon stepped back from the table, crossing his arms over his chest, with a look of absolute untouchable victory. Everyone in the room was staring at me, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. They fully expected tears. They expected me to beg for another chance to plead with Richard to reconsider his cruelty, or to start screaming hysterically so they could justify kicking me out into the freezing winter night. They wanted me to break under the immense weight of their coordinated psychological assault. They had cornered me in a freezing room, stripped me of my dignity, and handed me an ultimatum designed to leave me destitute. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air of the dining room fill my lungs. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the crushing despair they were trying so desperately to inflict upon me. What I felt was a cold, calculating clarity. I had spent my entire career dismantling arrogant, greedy individuals who believed they were above the law. The people sitting at this table were no different. They were simply bullies masquerading as high society elites. I reached deep into the pocket of my frayed, oversized wool coat. My fingers brushed against the smooth metal clip of my heavy-duty fountain pen. I pulled it out and clicked the top. The sharp mechanical sound made Brandon smile even wider. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought I was finally surrendering to their demands, accepting my fate as the discarded penniless wife. I brought the pen down to the thick manila envelope and smoothly slid the postnuptial agreement out onto the gravy-stained tablecloth. But I did not turn to the final page where the signature line awaited me. I kept the document perfectly flat on the very first page. I uncapped my pen and drew a slow, deliberate, thick circle around the entire fourth paragraph of the contract. The scratch of the pen on the premium paper was the only sound in the room. Then, with a calm, precise motion, I slid the crisp white document directly across the polished mahogany wood until it stopped right in front of Andre. I looked up, locking eyes with the arrogant corporate lawyer. "You drafted this, did you not, Andre?" Andre did not look away. Instead, he let out a low, booming laugh that rumbled deep in his chest. He pushed his empty wine glass aside and leaned his heavy frame forward, planting both of his elbows firmly on the polished mahogany table. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his custom Tom Ford suit, ensuring the platinum Rolex on his wrist caught the light from the chandelier. It was a calculated predatory movement designed to make him appear larger and more physically imposing than anyone else in the room. "Yes, Catherine, I drafted it," Andre said, his voice dripping with absolute unwavering arrogance. "And I did not just draft it. I bulletproofed it. I spent 6 billable hours at my firm, ensuring that this document is a complete and impenetrable fortress around Richard's assets. Andre interlaced his fingers, resting his chin on his hands as he stared me down. You see, when Richard came to me and explained that his son needed to secure the family estate against potential future liabilities, I knew exactly what to do. I created a fiduciary firewall. This agreement contains an irrevocable waiver of equitable distribution. It explicitly reclassifies all current and future marital assets as separate property. I even included a severability clause that essentially guarantees that if you try to contest any single page of this document, the financial penalties will trigger a cascade of debt that will bankrupt you before you even see the inside of a courtroom. He paused, letting the heavy legal jargon hang in the freezing air of the dining room. He wanted me to feel utterly overwhelmed, crushed beneath the weight of terminology he assumed I could not possibly comprehend. He was speaking to me the way a strict teacher speaks to a slow, disobedient child. He fully expected the big, complicated words to confuse me into total submission. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not blink. I did not shift in my chair. I just watched him bask in the glory of his own perceived brilliance. You have absolutely no leverage here. Catherine Andre continued his tone, shifting from professional to deeply personal. He pointed a heavy finger directly at the center of the document. Let me explain this to you in very simple terms, so you do not get confused. Legally speaking, you contribute zero economic value to this marriage. You do not have a salary. You do not own any equity. You do not possess any independent investments. In the eyes of the state, and certainly in the eyes of this family, you are nothing but a liability. You are a negative line item on Richard's balance sheet. Beatrice nodded vigorously from across the table, her diamond tennis bracelet flashing as she raised her glass in agreement. Listen to my husband, Catherine, Beatrice sneered. He bills $1,000 an hour to destroy people who are much smarter and much richer than you. You should be thanking him for even taking the time to write this up, instead of just having you thrown out into the snow without a second thought. Andre held up a hand, silencing his wife, wanting to deliver the final blow himself. He leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest, looking at me with pure disgust. If you sign that paper right now, you get $5,000. Andre said, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening register. It is a gift. It is charity. Take it, pack your bags, and disappear. But if you refuse, if you try to drag this family into a protracted legal battle, hoping for a settlement, I promise you, I will make your life a living hell. I will personally bury you in so many discovery motions and preliminary injunctions that you will not be able to afford a public defender. I will drag your name through the mud. I will ensure that you leave this marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. Andre paused, his eyes trailing up and down my frayed, oversized wool coat. His lips curled into a vicious, mocking sneer. Though judging by that pathetic coat you are wearing, you are already there. Just sign the document, Catherine, and save us all the trouble of ruining you. The dining room fell completely silent. Brandon was grinning from ear to ear, clearly thrilled to have a high-powered corporate attorney doing his dirty work. Richard had finally put his phone down and was watching me closely, waiting for the tears to start falling. They were all waiting for the moment I shattered, the moment I picked up the pen and surrendered my entire life to their cruelty. Instead of picking up the pen, I reached out and gently tapped my index finger against the front page of the contract. The sound was sharp and deliberate. I looked at the document, taking in the aggressive formatting and the heavy-handed legal threats that Andre had so proudly described. It was exactly the kind of bloated, overconfident contract I had spent years tearing to shreds in federal courtrooms. It relied entirely on intimidation rather than actual solid jurisprudence. It was the sloppy, arrogant work of a man who was used to bullying people who did not know any better. I slowly lifted my gaze from the paper and locked eyes with Andre. The smug satisfaction on his face was practically radiating across the table. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds, letting him think he had won, letting the anticipation build until the air in the room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Are you completely sure you passed the bar exam? Andre, I asked, my voice deadly calm and perfectly even. Andre's smug smile instantly vanished. His brow furrowed in sudden sharp confusion. Excuse me, he snapped, his deep voice carrying a sudden edge of defensive anger. What did you just say to me? I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I leaned forward just slightly, resting my hands on the table right next to the gravy-stained envelope. I asked if you actually passed the bar exam. I repeated, articulating every single syllable with crystal clarity. Because if you had, you would know that Clause 4, Section B is a direct, undeniable violation of the Marital Property Act. The silence in the grand dining room became absolute. The instrumental holiday music playing softly from the hidden surround sound speakers seemed to fade away completely. Andre stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant smirk wiped clean off his face. He blinked twice, clearly trying to process how the unemployed housewife sitting in a frayed thrift store coat had just correctly identified a fatal statutory flaw in his meticulously drafted contract. "That is ridiculous!" Andre sputtered, his deep voice losing its smooth, practiced rhythm. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You are just throwing out random legal terms you heard somewhere to try and save yourself." I did not break eye contact. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, projecting an aura of complete and utter calm. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, Andre. You drafted a total waiver of equitable distribution, but you conveniently failed to attach a comprehensive schedule of assets and liabilities to the back of this document. Under state law, any postnuptial agreement that attempts to waive a spouse's rights to marital property is completely unenforceable if it is not accompanied by a full, transparent financial disclosure from the party requesting the waiver. You cannot legally force someone to sign away their rights to assets when you actively and deliberately conceal the true value of those assets." Andre shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair. He glanced quickly at Richard, then back to me. He opened his mouth to argue, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I was just getting started. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice steady and commanding, "you presented this highly complex document to me at a holiday dinner surrounded by hostile family members and demanded an immediate signature under the explicit threat of eviction. That establishes a clear textbook presumption of duress and coercive control. You also failed to provide a mandatory provision allowing me reasonable time to seek independent legal counsel before signing. Any family court judge in this district would look at the circumstances of this evening and throw this document straight into the shredder before you even finished your opening statement." Beatrice let out a sharp, offended gasp. She turned sharply to her husband, her diamond bracelet clinking against her wine glass. "Andre, what is she talking about? Tell her she is wrong. Put her in her place right now." Andre tugged nervously at the collar of his custom shirt. His confident posture had completely deflated. "She is just grasping at straws, Beatrice," he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "It is a standard intimidation tactic used by desperate people." "Is it, Andre?" I asked, leaning forward just a fraction to ensure he felt the full weight of my gaze. "Let us look at Clause 7, the severability clause you were bragging about 5 minutes ago. You claimed it protects the rest of the contract if one part fails, but you completely ignored the established state Supreme Court precedent, which clearly dictates that when the core fiduciary waiver is obtained through fraudulent concealment or severe duress, the entire agreement is rendered inherently unconscionable. The severability clause collapses right along with the rest of your fraud." Richard slammed his heavy fist against the mahogany table. The silverware rattled loudly against the crystal glasses, breaking the tension with a sudden burst of violence. "Enough of this nonsense!" Richard shouted, his face turning a dark, furious shade of red. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself, Catherine. You sit on my couch all day doing absolutely nothing, and suddenly you think you are some kind of legal expert because you binge-watch courtroom dramas on television using the internet I pay for. You are just parroting legal shows from TV. It is pathetic and it is embarrassing. Stop talking and sign the papers so we can finish our dinner." Brandon was pacing aggressively behind his chair, running his hands through his hair. His face was twisted with a mixture of rage and rising, undeniable panic. He needed this quick cash grab to work tonight, and his psychological ambush was falling apart right in front of his eyes. "You told me this contract was airtight," Brandon yelled, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Andre. "You said she would not have a leg to stand on. You said she would take the $5,000 and run. Why is she talking circles around you?" "I am not going to sit here and debate complex contract law with a delusional housewife," Andre growled, his voice rising in volume to mask his obvious professional insecurity. "The document is perfectly sound. She is just trying to stall because she knows she is cornered. You have no money, Catherine. You have no power here. No judge is ever going to listen to a woman who cannot even afford to buy her own groceries. I looked around the table at the four of them. They were completely unraveling. The perfectly coordinated family attack had devolved into shouting, sweating, and bitter finger-pointing. They were entirely reliant on volume and intimidation because their actual foundation was built on sand. They had expected me to cower, to cry, to beg for mercy. Instead, I had systematically dismantled their primary weapon without raising my voice a single decibel. I reached out and placed my hands firmly on either side of the thick manila envelope and the crisp white pages of the post-nuptial agreement. The room suddenly went quiet again as they watched my hands, waiting to see what I would do. Richard crossed his arms, wearing a hard, expectant glare. Brandon stopped pacing and leaned over the table. His eyes locked on the pen sitting near my plate, desperate for me to pick it up. I picked up the heavy stack of premium legal paper. I gripped the pages tightly in both hands. I did not reach for the pen. I locked eyes with Andre, ensuring he saw exactly how little his 6 billable hours meant to me. Then, with a single sharp, forceful motion, I tore the entire contract straight down the middle. The loud, crisp sound of ripping paper echoed like a gunshot in the grand dining room. Beatrice screamed in genuine shock. Brandon let out a furious, animalistic curse, slamming his hands onto the back of his chair. I dropped the 2 torn halves of the document back onto the gravy-stained tablecloth, pushing them away from my plate. "This piece of garbage is legally unenforceable," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable finality, "and I am not signing it." The sharp sound of tearing paper hung in the freezing air of the dining room. I let the 2 halves of the contract fall onto the gravy-stained tablecloth. Brandon stared at the ruined document, his face contorting from shock into something far more dangerous. He genuinely believed his psychological ambush was foolproof. He thought he had cornered a helpless, terrified housewife who would crumble at the first sign of complex legal threats. Seeing his ultimate weapon reduced to trash shattered his arrogant composure. Brandon let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He shook his head, looking down at me as if I were a petulant child who had just broken a valuable toy. He planted his hands on his hips, completely abandoning the faux professional demeanor he had tried to project earlier. "You think you are so clever, Katie," Brandon sneered, his voice dripping with pure malice. "You think tearing up a piece of paper actually changes anything about your situation tonight? Do you honestly believe I only printed one single copy of that document?" Before I could answer, Brandon raised his right hand and snapped his fingers loudly. The sharp sound echoed off the crystal glasses and the vaulted ceiling. Instantly, the heavy oak door leading to the kitchen swung open. A man stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with a thick, muscular neck and a torso built like a concrete block. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting dark suit that stretched tightly across his broad shoulders. He did not carry a briefcase. He did not carry a notary stamp or an identification badge. He carried the distinct heavy aura of a man who was paid in untraceable cash to stand behind people and make them feel very small and very afraid. The man did not say a single word to anyone at the table. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps past the lavish serving buffet, heading straight for the grand double doors that led out to the main foyer. He grabbed the polished brass handles, pulled the heavy doors completely shut, and turned the deadbolt. The loud metallic click of the lock sliding into place was unmistakable in the quiet room. He then crossed his thick arms over his chest and planted his feet directly in front of the only exit. Brandon reached inside his tailored blazer and pulled out a second perfectly pristine copy of the post-nuptial agreement. He tossed it onto the table, letting it land right over the torn remnants of the first draft. He pulled a premium silver ballpoint pen from his pocket and slammed it down next to the crisp white paper. "Allow me to introduce you to our notary," Brandon said, gesturing vaguely toward the giant blocking the door. "He is here to officially witness your signature. And just so we are completely clear on the schedule for this evening, you are not leaving this room until your name is on that bottom line. You can sit there in your ridiculous thrift store coat all night long if you want to, but those doors stay locked until you sign." I turned my attention away from Brandon and looked at the other guests. Beatrice looked slightly flushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and undeniable thrill. She was actually enjoying the sudden theatrical violence of the moment. Andre, the brilliant corporate attorney, had the decency to look deeply uncomfortable. He shifted his weight in his expensive chair, his eyes darting nervously toward the locked door. As a practicing lawyer, Andre knew exactly what this looked like in the eyes of the law. He knew the definition of false imprisonment and criminal coercion. Yet he remained completely silent. His arrogant bravado had vanished, replaced by a cowardly willingness to look the other way, while his nephew committed a blatant crime. I looked to the head of the table. Richard was calmly swirling the remaining red wine in his crystal glass. He watched the hired muscle guard the door with absolute chilling indifference. He was entirely complicit in this physical intimidation. Richard said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any panic. Your son just hired a thug to barricade your wife inside your dining room. Are you going to sit there and drink your wine while he holds me hostage? Richard let out a long, dramatic sigh. He set his wine glass down on the mahogany table and looked at me with an expression of pure exhausted annoyance. Do not be so dramatic, Katie Richards said, his tone dripping with gaslighting condescension. Nobody is holding you hostage. Brandon is just making sure we finalize this business arrangement tonight without any more of your hysterical interruptions. You brought this on yourself by being so unreasonably stubborn and trying to play lawyer. Just pick up the pen, sign the paper, and the door opens. It is entirely up to you. You hold the key to your own release. I looked at the man guarding the exit. A true notary public is an impartial witness commissioned by the state to verify identity and ensure a document is signed under free will. Bringing in hired muscle to physically trap a spouse in a room until they sign a financial waiver was not just legally void. It was a severe criminal act. They were so blinded by their greed and their absolute certainty of my helplessness that they were actively tumbling headfirst into profound legal jeopardy. I spent years presiding over federal courtrooms. I had stared down cartel money launderers and violent racketeers who tried to use physical intimidation to manipulate the justice system. A 24-year-old spoiled brat and a cheap thug in a bad suit did not even register on my radar of actual threats. They thought they were trapping a terrified housewife. They did not realize they had just locked themselves in a room with a federal judge. I slowly reached out and picked up the silver ballpoint pen. Brandon smirked, his chest puffing out with pride, truly believing I had finally broken under the pressure. I looked at the locked doors, then at the hired muscle, and finally turned my gaze directly to Brandon's triumphant face. I tapped the pen lightly against the pristine paper. So I said, my voice ringing with a cold, sharp amusement that wiped the smile right off Brandon's face. We have moved from civil disputes to felonies. Fascinating. The hired muscle did not appreciate my lack of fear. At a sharp nod from Brandon, the massive man stepped away from the locked double doors and closed the distance between us. His heavy footsteps thudded against the hardwood floor until he was standing directly behind my chair. I could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame and smell the overpowering scent of cheap peppermint cologne masking stale cigarette smoke. He placed one thick, calloused hand on the high wooden back of my dining chair, leaning in just enough to cast a dark shadow over my gravy-stained plate. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to trigger a primal flight response. I did not flinch. I did not turn my head to look at him. In a room full of predators, exposing your neck is a fatal mistake. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the people sitting around the mahogany table. Beatrice found the sudden escalation of physical threats absolutely delightful. She let out a high musical laugh, reaching for the open bottle of expensive Cabernet sitting near the floral centerpiece. She poured herself another generous glass, the dark red liquid splashing against the crystal. You can throw around all the fancy television lawyer vocabulary you want, Catherine Beatrice said, taking a long, satisfied sip. But at the end of the day, you are still a penniless woman locked in a dining room with a man who gets paid to make people cooperate. This is not a courtroom. This is reality. You are putting on a very brave face for someone who is about to be thrown out into the snow. I must admit, it is fantastic dinner theater. I have not been this entertained at Christmas in years. Andre remained completely silent beside her. The brilliant corporate attorney was staring intensely at his empty plate. He knew that everything I had just said about the legal invalidity of the contract was absolutely correct. He knew that locking a woman in a room to force a signature crossed a terrifying legal line. His arrogant bravado had entirely evaporated, leaving him paralyzed by the sudden realization that this situation was spiraling wildly out of his control. I ignored Beatrice and her theatrical wine drinking. I ignored Brandon, who was pacing near the windows with an anxious, vibrating energy. I focused my entire attention on the man sitting at the head of the table. Richard, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous authority that cut through the tension in the room. You brought me into this house 3 years ago. You told your friends and your family that you rescued me. You painted this beautiful, pathetic picture of a helpless woman who was just so incredibly grateful to have a wealthy husband to put a roof over her head. You wanted a quiet, obedient wife who would smile at your country club dinners, look good in the jewelry you bought, and never ask any difficult questions. Richard stiffened. He crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw clenching tight. He did not like the shift in my tone. I was no longer speaking to him as a subordinate. I was speaking to him as an equal, and it terrified him. You thought you purchased a decorative accessory. I continued, leaning forward slightly, ignoring the looming presence of the hired thug standing inches behind my neck. You assumed that because I did not demand a high-powered career or flaunt my own income, I was simply stupid. You thought my silence was ignorance. But you made a massive catastrophic miscalculation. What are you talking about? Richard snapped, his voice tight with defensive anger. Stop speaking in riddles, Katie. You are making a fool of yourself. Just sign the paper and we can end this nightmare. I am talking about your absolute lack of morality, Richard, I said smoothly. I am talking about the fact that while you were out playing the big successful real estate developer, I was the one maintaining this household. I was the one sorting the mail. I was the one organizing your chaotic home office. I was the one filing your disorganized tax documents and answering the phone when your creditors started calling. You thought you were so clever hiding your financial statements in the bottom drawer of your desk. You thought I would never bother to look at the numbers because you assumed I could not understand them. Brandon stopped pacing. He turned to look at me, his eyes widening with the first genuine spark of panic I had seen all night. Make her sign it, Brandon demanded, his voice cracking slightly. He pointed at the fake notary. Make her pick up the pen right now. I did not even blink. I kept my eyes perfectly fixed on Richard, watching the color slowly drain from his handsome, arrogant face as the reality of my words began to sink in. You thought I was blind, Richard? I said, projecting my voice so every single syllable struck him like a physical blow. But I saw everything. I saw the offshore accounts you tried to set up to hide assets from the IRS. I saw the exorbitant contractor invoices you inflated to siphon cash into your own private checking accounts. I saw the frantic, desperate emails you sent to your broker when the market shifted and your over-leveraged properties started to bleed money. I stood in the background playing the quiet, grateful wife while I watched you systematically destroy your own financial empire through pure, unadulterated greed. Beatrice lowered her wine glass, her mocking smile finally faltering. She looked at her brother, expecting him to shout, to deny it, to call me a liar. But Richard was completely silent. His hands were gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned completely white. And because I have been paying such close attention, I said, shifting my gaze from Richard to Brandon, I know exactly why this is happening tonight. I know why you could not wait until after the holidays to hand me a legal document. I know why you felt the need to lock the doors and bring in a hired thug to physically threaten me into signing a total marital asset waiver on Christmas Eve. Shut up, Brandon yelled, taking a step toward the table, his face twisted in pure, desperate rage. Do not say another word. You do not know anything. I picked up the silver ballpoint pen. I held it between my fingers, feeling the heavy, expensive metal. I did not move it toward the contract. I pointed it directly at Brandon's chest. You think I have been sitting at home baking cookies, Richard? I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the freezing dining room. I have been balancing your books. I know exactly why Brandon is so desperate for my signature tonight. I kept the heavy silver pen pointed directly at Brandon. The air in the grand dining room felt suddenly thick, suffocatingly tight as the reality of my words settled over the table. The arrogant, triumphant smirk that had been plastered across Brandon's face all evening vanished in an instant. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above the collar of his expensive cashmere sweater. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to maintain the illusion of the wealthy, untouchable heir who commanded the room. You are bluffing, Brandon sneered, but his voice cracked just a fraction of an inch, betraying the intense, rising panic beneath his bravado. You do not know anything about my finances. You are just a crazy woman trying to buy time. I lowered the pen and rested my hands neatly on the gravy-stained tablecloth. Am I Brandon? Let us talk about your highly successful business ventures. You love to stand around at your father's country club and tell all the wealthy investors that you are a visionary venture capitalist. You drive a Porsche you did not pay for, and you wear designer suits to look the part. You told this entire family that your tech startup was on the verge of a major breakthrough. But there is no tech startup. There never was a revolutionary app, and there never was a software development team. Beatrice frowned, looking back and forth between me and her nephew. What on earth is she talking about, Brandon? You showed us the business plan last year. There was no business plan, Beatrice, I said, keeping my gaze locked entirely on the 24-year-old standing near the window. Brandon is a compulsive gambler, and a spectacularly bad one at that. He did not lose $30,000 on server costs and marketing algorithms. He lost it betting on offshore sportsbooks. Brandon's face drained of all color. He looked like all the blood had suddenly rushed to his feet. He took a stumbling step backward until his shoulder hit the heavy velvet drapes. "Shut up," he whispered, a stark contrast to his earlier shouting. I did not stop. I delivered the facts with the clinical, merciless precision of a prosecutor laying out an indictment. October 14th, you lost $25,000 on a college football parlay that busted in the very first quarter. November 2nd, you dropped $40,000 on an NBA point spread. By the week of Thanksgiving, you had burned through every single cent of the so-called seed money your father gave you. Andre leaned forward in his chair, his legal mind rapidly processing the severity of the situation. He looked at Brandon, his dark eyes narrowing with intense suspicion. If he blew through the seed money in November, how has he been funding his lifestyle for the past month? I turned to Andre, offering him a cold, razor-sharp smile. When the bank finally cut off his credit cards, Brandon turned to private lenders. The kind of lenders who do not send polite collection letters in the mail. The kind of lenders who send men exactly like our fake notary over there to stand in your living room and make sure you understand the stakes. You owe exactly $200,000 to a gambling syndicate operating out of the city, Brandon. And they called your father last week to collect. The hired muscle guarding the locked doors shifted uncomfortably, crossing his thick arms. He clearly did not like that his actual profession was being broadcast to a room full of people. Beatrice gasped loudly, her manicured hand flying to cover her mouth. She turned to her nephew in absolute horror. Brandon, tell me she is lying. Tell me you do not owe $200,000 to criminals. Brandon could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. Andre looked violently ill. As an arrogant corporate lawyer, he prided himself on his pristine reputation. He suddenly realized he had been drafted into a desperate illegal debt collection scheme. He had drafted a fraudulent post-nuptial agreement not to protect a family legacy, but to appease organized crime. I kept my voice perfectly calm, explaining the brutal reality of the situation to the entire room. This legal document you threw in my face tonight was never about protecting the family estate from a gold digger. It was a desperate, panicked extraction plan. If you could terrorize me into signing away my marital rights to this property, Richard could immediately liquidate my half of the home equity. He needed my signature tonight, so he could wire the cash to the bookies tomorrow morning before they decided to break his son's legs. The truth hit the dining room with the devastating force of a freight train. The perfectly orchestrated Christmas dinner. The cruel jokes, the intimidating legal jargon. It was all nothing but a cheap shakedown. They were not powerful elites putting a dependent wife in her place. They were terrified, drowning men trying to rob a woman they assumed was too stupid to fight back. Brandon looked frantically at the head of the table, silently begging his father to stop me, to shut me up, to do something. But Richard was staring blankly at his empty plate, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw. He was completely paralyzed by the exposure of his darkest, most shameful secret. You thought you could bully a naive housewife into funding your gambling addiction, I said, my tone laced with absolute unyielding disgust. You thought you could terrify me into signing away my financial security to save your own skin. You locked the doors and brought in a thug because you are a coward, Brandon. Beatrice looked at her brother, her eyes wide with a profound mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal. The pristine, flawless image of her wealthy brother and his successful son had just been entirely incinerated. Richard, Beatrice stammered, her voice trembling as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table. Is this true? Did you really orchestrate this entire night just to steal from your wife to pay off his gambling debts? I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that promised absolutely no mercy. Oh, Beatrice, he did much more than just orchestrate a dinner. I shifted my gaze back to my husband, watching him sweat under the brilliant light of the crystal chandelier. But that is not the best part, is it, Richard? Tell your sister what you did to the house. Richard remained completely paralyzed at the head of the table. The silence in the dining room was no longer just tense, it was suffocating. Beatrice turned her head sharply, staring at her brother with wide, horrified eyes. She waited for him to deny it. She waited for him to pound his fist on the polished mahogany wood and call me a vicious liar. But Richard could not even lift his head. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, catching the light from the extravagant chandelier above. Richard, Beatrice demanded, her voice cracking, as the pristine illusion of her perfect wealthy family shattered completely. Answer her right now. What did you do to the house? He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the lever being pulled. Since my husband seems to have lost his voice, I will gladly fill in the blanks for you, Beatrice, I said, keeping my tone as conversational and pleasant as if we were discussing the winter weather. I turned my attention back to the man sitting across from me, watching him shrink under my gaze. It happened exactly 6 months ago. I began ensuring every word was perfectly enunciated, so there could be no misunderstandings. June 12th, to be precise. Brandon had just blown through his first major round of borrowed cash. The bookies were starting to apply serious physical pressure, and Richard panicked. He realized he needed a massive injection of liquid capital to pay off the initial debt before things got violent. So he went to his private wealth manager at the bank to take out a second mortgage on this estate. I paused, letting the reality of the situation sink into the minds of the people sitting around the table. As a corporate attorney, Andre, I am sure you are intimately familiar with the real estate laws in this state, I said, shifting my gaze to the lawyer who was now sweating heavily through his custom suit. You know that you cannot take out a second mortgage on a primary marital residence without the explicit notarized consent of both spouses. The bank requires both signatures to approve the loan. Andre swallowed hard. He nodded slowly, his dark eyes wide with a growing, terrifying realization. He knew exactly where this was going, and he knew it was a one-way ticket to prison. Richard knew I would never agree to leverage our home to fund his son's degenerate gambling addiction. I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. He knew I would demand a full financial audit before I ever picked up a pen. So instead of having an honest conversation with his wife, Richard took the loan documents into his private study, locked the door, and spent 3 hours practicing my handwriting. The collective gasp from Beatrice and Andre was audible over the soft holiday music playing in the background. He forged my signature on a federally insured bank document I stated, laying out the crime with absolute clarity. He fabricated a notary seal using a shady contact from his country club, submitted the fraudulent paperwork, and pulled $150,000 of equity straight out of the foundation of this house. Andre jumped up from his chair. He moved so fast that the heavy wooden legs scraped loudly and violently against the hardwood floor, nearly tipping the chair backward. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire personality all evening completely evaporated. He was no longer a smug, wealthy relative enjoying a cruel holiday prank. He was a licensed attorney realizing he was sitting in the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy. Richard, did you forge a bank document? Andre demanded, his deep voice shaking with a volatile mixture of panic and absolute fury. Look at me right now and tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not commit federal wire fraud. Richard finally looked up. His face was a mask of pathetic, desperate misery. I had to do it, Andre. Richard pleaded, his voice cracking pitifully as he reached his hands out across the table. You do not understand the kind of people Brandon was dealing with. They were threatening to come to the house. I was just trying to protect my son. I was going to pay the bank back before Katie ever found out. It was just a temporary solution. Andre threw his hands in the air, letting out a loud, incredulous shout. A temporary solution? You forged your wife's signature on a commercial bank loan to pay off illegal gambling debts. That is bank fraud, Richard. That is a felony. Do you have any idea what you have done? You brought me into this house tonight to draft a post-nuptial agreement designed to extract equity from a property that is already tied up in a fraudulent mortgage. You made me an unwitting conspirator to a federal crime. If the state bar finds out about this, I will lose my license. I could go to prison. The united front of the family entirely fractured. The elegant Christmas dinner descended into absolute chaos. Beatrice started screaming at her brother, her diamond tennis bracelet flashing as she waved her arms frantically in the air. "How could you be so stupid, Richard?" she shrieked. "You have ruined everything. You dragged us into a criminal investigation to cover up for your useless gambling addict of a son." Brandon spun around, his face twisted with blind rage. "Do not you dare call me useless, Beatrice," Brandon yelled back, pointing a shaking finger at his aunt. "I am not the only one with problems here. Dad is the one who messed up the paperwork. He is the one who did not get enough money to cover the interest payments." I sat back in my chair watching them tear each other apart. The synchronized bullies who had spent the last hour mocking my frayed coat and demanding my absolute surrender were now turning their viciousness on one another. The hired guarding the locked doors looked extremely uncomfortable, clearly calculating how fast he could get out of the house before the police inevitably arrived. I reached forward and picked up my crystal water goblet. The condensation on the glass was cold against my fingers. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the freezing water soothe my throat. I lowered the glass, placing it gently back onto the mahogany table. The soft clink of the crystal cut through the shouting. "He did forge the documents," I said calmly, raising my voice just enough to silence the screaming relatives. "He committed federal bank fraud to get the cash." I offered them a cold, razor-sharp smile, leaning forward to deliver the final devastating blow to their entire reality. But unfortunately, Richard has a gambling problem of his own. He hasn't made a mortgage payment in 4 months. Beatrice let out a sound that was half shriek and half sob. 4 months, she screamed at her brother, her hands pulling frantically at her perfectly styled hair. "You have not paid the mortgage on this estate in 4 months. We are sitting in a house that is actively going into foreclosure, and you brought us here to witness you commit federal fraud to cover it up." Brandon began pacing the length of the grand dining room like a trapped animal. His expensive loafers slapped hard and fast against the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as pure panic completely took over. He finally realized his father had absolutely no money to save him from the violent bookies he had borrowed from. "If you have not paid the mortgage," Brandon yelled, stopping to point a shaking accusatory finger directly at Richard, "then where is the cash you promised me? You looked me in the eye and said you had the liquid capital to get those dangerous guys off my back. Where did the money from the second mortgage go?" Richard buried his face in his hands, his elbows resting heavily on the table next to his half-eaten holiday dinner. He looked utterly pathetic, a hollow, broken shell of the arrogant man who had ordered me to sign my life away just 20 minutes earlier. "I used the mortgage money to try and win back your losses," Richard muttered, his voice muffled and thick with despair. "I had a sure thing. I had an inside tip on a massive commercial real estate development in Vegas. If the investment had hit, I could have paid off the bank, paid off your bookies, and still had millions left over in clean cash. But the developer went bankrupt overnight, and the entire investment vanished. I lost everything." Andre threw his hands in the air, his platinum Rolex flashing brightly under the crystal chandelier. "You gambled away a fraudulent bank loan on an unverified real estate tip." Andre shouted, his polished corporate composure completely and utterly destroyed. "You are not just a criminal, Richard, you are an absolute idiot. You have jeopardized my entire legal career with your reckless, degenerate behavior. I am leaving. I am walking out that door right now, and if any of you try to contact me or my law firm, I will deny I was ever in this house tonight." Andre turned sharply toward the heavy oak double doors, but the towering hired muscle stood firmly in his way, blocking the only exit. The large man looked extremely confused, his eyes darting between Brandon and Richard, clearly unsure who was actually in charge anymore or who was going to pay him his cash fee. "Move aside right now," Andre ordered, using his most aggressive, authoritative courtroom voice to try and intimidate the guard. The giant just crossed his thick arms over his chest, looking at Brandon for instructions. But Brandon was too busy having a complete mental breakdown near the windows to even notice the standoff happening at the door. Brandon was hyperventilating, muttering to himself about how the syndicate was going to break his legs by the end of the week. I decided it was time to end the pathetic circus playing out in front of me. I stood up from my chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, and commanded immediate attention. I did not need to scream or wave my arms to be heard. I simply projected my voice with the cold, hard, unyielding authority I had spent years perfecting in federal courtrooms. Everyone stop talking, I said. The sheer absolute force of my tone cut through the panic and the shouting like a razor-sharp blade. Beatrice snapped her mouth shut, her eyes wide with fear. Brandon froze in his tracks, staring at me as if he was seeing me for the very first time. Andre slowly turned around from the locked doors, and Richard finally lifted his tear-stained face from his hands to look at the woman he thought he had broken. I reached deep into the pocket of my frayed, oversized wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen, bringing up a highly secured legal document. The bright light of the screen illuminated my face in the dim room as I looked down at the official text. I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting them feel the absolute shift in power dynamics. You have been running to the mailbox every single afternoon to intercept the bank notices, Richard, I said, looking right into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. You thought if you hid the warning letters from me, you could maintain the illusion of your wealth just a little bit longer. But you conveniently forgot that commercial lenders are legally required to file public notices of default. I have the official county document right here on my phone. I began to read the text aloud, my voice ringing clearly in the silent dining room. Notice of intent to foreclose filed in the county clerk office exactly 14 days ago. It details your gross financial negligence, your 4 consecutive missed mortgage payments, and your complete failure to respond to any of their mandated financial inquiries or settlement offers. Beatrice let out a soft whimper, sinking back into her chair. The reality of losing her wealthy social status was hitting her harder than the threat of criminal charges. She cared more about her country club reputation than her brother's freedom. I walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, my footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. You brought Andre here tonight to draft a predatory post-nuptial agreement because you thought you still had home equity to extract. You and your son thought you could ambush me at Christmas, force me to sign away my marital rights, throw me out into the freezing cold, and liquidate the house to save yourselves from the violent criminals you owe money to. I stopped right next to Richard's chair. I looked down at him with pure, unadulterated disdain. The man who had mocked my thrift store coat and called me a worthless dependent was now trembling in his expensive suit, waiting for my final judgment. I put my smartphone back into my pocket, folding my hands neatly in front of me. You do not own this house anymore to kick me out of it, Richard, I said, delivering the final crushing blow with perfect icy precision. The bank got tired of waiting for your money. They sold your defaulted debt to a private equity firm 3 days ago, a firm called Apex Holdings. Andre froze. The name of the private equity firm hung in the freezing air of the dining room like a physical weight. As a corporate attorney, Andre knew exactly how the distressed debt market operated. He knew that when a traditional bank sold off a defaulted mortgage to a private equity firm, the rules of engagement drastically changed. Banks were slow, bureaucratic, and often willing to negotiate long-term payment plans. Private equity firms were sharks. They bought toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, with the sole aggressive intention of seizing the underlying assets immediately and liquidating them for a massive profit. For a few seconds, absolute terror washed over Andre's face. He looked at Richard with pure disgust, realizing the sheer magnitude of the financial catastrophe his brother-in-law had invited into their lives. But Andre was a man whose entire identity was built on his towering ego and his perceived intellectual superiority. He could not stand being paralyzed in a room full of panicked relatives. He needed to be the smartest man in the room. He needed to take control. Andre abruptly stood up, pushing his heavy wooden chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He violently straightened the lapels of his custom suit, took a deep breath, and forced his face into a mask of aggressive professional determination. Richard, look at me right now, Andre barked, using his booming courtroom voice to cut through Beatrice's sobbing and Brandon's frantic pacing. Stop acting like a defeated child and listen to me. This is a severe crisis, but it is not a death sentence. We can still handle this. Richard slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at Andre with the desperate, pathetic hope of a drowning man being thrown a frayed rope. How Richard whispered, his voice trembling. They filed the intent to foreclose 14 days ago. The grace period is over. They are going to take the house. They are going to take everything. They are not going to take anything if we strike first, Andre commanded, stepping around the mahogany table to stand directly over Richard. Tomorrow morning, the very second the courts open, my firm is going to file an emergency Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition on your behalf. The moment that petition is stamped by the clerk, it triggers an automatic stay. That means all collection actions, including foreclosures, are legally frozen immediately. Apex Holdings will not be able to touch this estate. Beatrice wiped her tear-streaked face, letting out a shaky gasp of relief. She looked at her husband with absolute adoration, thrilled that he was stepping in to save her family's wealth and her precious social standing. "You can do that?" That Andre Beatrice asked, her voice hitching. "You can stop them from taking the house. I can stall them indefinitely." Andre boasted, his chest puffing out as his arrogant confidence fully returned. Apex Holdings is just a vulture fund. They thrive on quick, easy seizures. When they see that we have trapped this asset in a complex, drawn-out federal bankruptcy proceeding, they will back off. They do not want to spend years paying litigation fees. I will force their legal team to the negotiating table, and I will restructure this debt on terms that allow Richard to keep the property. Brandon stopped his frantic pacing near the windows. He practically ran over to Andre, his face twisted with desperate, selfish need. "And my debt," Brandon demanded, grabbing the sleeve of Andre's expensive suit. "What about the $200,000 I owe the syndicate? The bankruptcy will not stop them from coming after me. You have to get cash out of the house to pay them off." Andre violently shoved Brandon's hand away from his jacket. "Shut your mouth and let the adults handle this." Andre snapped, glaring at his nephew with pure contempt. "You will hide in a hotel until I figure out a way to leverage the remaining equity to cover your pathetic gambling problem. Right now, we are executing a financial triage, and you are not the priority." Andre turned his back on Brandon and Richard. He slowly pivoted until he was facing me. The smug, predatory smile was back on his face. He actually believed he had just saved the day. He believed his rapid-fire legal maneuvering had completely neutralized the threat of the foreclosure, and now he was going to use this exact crisis to finish the job he came here to do. He was going to use the impending bankruptcy to terrorize me out of the house. He walked toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He stopped just inches from my chair, looking down at me, as if I were a foolish obstacle he was about to effortlessly remove. "Well, Catherine," Andre said, his deep voice dripping with renewed mocking authority, "it seems your little dramatic revelation about the foreclosure did not have the devastating impact you hoped for. You thought you were dropping a bomb, but all you did was give me the exact information I needed to secure Richard's assets." I remained seated, keeping my hands neatly folded in my lap. I did not blink. I just watched him construct his own trap. "You heard the reality of the situation," Andre continued, leaning down, so his face was level with mine. "This estate is drowning in toxic debt. Richard is facing federal fraud charges and a massive, highly public bankruptcy proceeding. The ship is officially sinking, and it is going down fast. If you stay married to him without a binding asset waiver, his creditors are going to come after you too. They will attach themselves to your name, ruin your credit, and garnish whatever meager wages you manage to scrape together for the rest of your miserable life." Andre pointed a heavy finger at the torn pieces of the post-nuptial agreement sitting on the gravy-stained tablecloth. "I can have my assistant print another copy of that waiver right now." Andre offered, his tone shifting into a faux sympathetic purr that made my skin crawl. "Consider this a genuine act of mercy. You see the disaster that is coming. Sign the papers tonight. Waive your right to be involved in the bankruptcy proceedings. Take the $5,000 in cash and get out of this house before you drown with him. It is the only smart move you can possibly make." The room was silent again. Beatrice was smirking, her confidence fully restored. Richard was sitting up straighter, clearly relieved that his brother-in-law had taken the reins. Brandon was glaring at me, waiting for me to surrender. They truly believed they had flipped the script. They believed they had used their impending financial ruin as the ultimate weapon to force me out into the cold. I looked at Andre's smug, expectant face. I looked at the platinum Rolex on his wrist and the expensive cut of his suit. I felt a genuine bubbling sense of amusement rise in my chest. I let out a soft, melodic chuckle. The sound was so relaxed, so completely devoid of fear, that Andre immediately recoiled, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Andre, you really are a terrible lawyer," I said, my voice cutting through the freezing room with crystalline precision. "You think you can just file a Chapter 11 petition and magically freeze a private equity seizure on a commercial debt. But you clearly did not bother to check how Richard structured the fraudulent second mortgage. He did not file it under his personal name. He filed it under his commercial real estate LLC to bypass the standard residential lending limits. Andre's face went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks in a sudden violent rush. Because it is a commercial holding. I continued standing up slowly from my chair to ensure he felt the absolute dominance of my position. The standard consumer bankruptcy protections do not apply. You cannot restructure a commercial debt when the secured creditor has already filed a UCC Article 9 declaration for immediate seizure of the collateral. The grace period expired at noon today. I took a step closer to him, offering a cold, terrifying smile. And Apex Holdings is very, very aggressive. Andre staggered backward as if I had struck him across the jaw with a baseball bat. The legal reality of a Uniform Commercial Code Article 9 declaration paralyzed his highly trained corporate lawyer brain. He knew perfectly well that commercial loan defaults did not afford the debtor the luxury of drawn-out negotiations or bankruptcy shields. Apex Holdings had the absolute undeniable legal right to seize the property, change the locks, and liquidate every single asset on the premises, without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. The grand, arrogant rescue plan he had just loudly boasted about was entirely dead on arrival. Beatrice looked at her husband, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as her hands trembled. She waited for him to offer a counter-argument, a clever loophole, anything to save her social standing and her brother's wealth. But Andre just slowly lowered himself back into his chair, staring blankly at the torn pieces of the post-nuptial agreement on the gravy-stained tablecloth. He was entirely defeated. Richard remained completely mute at the head of the table. He was a broken man who had finally run out of lies to tell. But Brandon was not defeated. He was desperate. And desperation breeds a very specific, highly dangerous kind of stupidity. The realization that the house was gone, the equity was vanished, and the protective shield of federal bankruptcy was entirely unavailable, hit him with devastating force. The violent gambling syndicate he owed $200,000 to was not going to care about commercial real estate laws or private equity seizures. They only cared about cash, and Brandon had just realized he had absolutely none. The walls were closing in on him rapidly, and his mind completely snapped. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and rage. He could not accept that the quiet, unemployed woman he had mocked all evening had just systematically dismantled his entire life. "You are lying!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking violently as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are making all of this up to scare us. You do not know anything about commercial loans or private equity firms. You are just a pathetic gold digger trying to steal my father's money." Before anyone could even blink, Brandon lunged. He threw his entire body weight forward, scrambling directly across the wide mahogany table. He did not care about the expensive crystal goblets or the imported winter roses. His arms swept violently through the elaborate floral centerpiece, knocking over 2 open bottles of expensive red wine. The dark liquid spilled like fresh blood across the white tablecloth, shattering wine glasses and sending heavy sterling silver flatware clattering loudly to the hardwood floor. He reached directly for my hand, his fingers clawing desperately to snatch my smartphone away from me. He wanted to see the screen. He wanted to prove that the foreclosure notice and the legal declarations I had just read from were fabricated. "Give me that phone," he roared, his face flushed with panicked sweat, leaning so far over the ruined table that his expensive leather shoes nearly left the floor. "Show me the documents right now. You are bluffing." I stepped back smoothly, pulling my phone entirely out of his frantic reach. I slipped the device safely back into the deep pocket of my frayed wool coat. I did not scream. I did not call out for Richard to control his violent son. I simply watched Brandon thrash against the table, destroying the lavish holiday dinner in a fit of absolute pathetic desperation. But the sudden explosion of physical chaos triggered a reaction from the man guarding the locked double doors. The hired muscle, the cheap thug, Brandon had brought in to play the role of the intimidating notary, decided it was time to earn his untraceable cash fee. He had stood silently by the exit for the last 30 minutes, clearly confused by the complex legal arguments flying back and forth across the room. But violence, aggression, and physical control were languages he understood perfectly. When he saw his employer lunging across the table and shouting, he reacted on pure aggressive instinct. He crossed the grand dining room in 3 massive, heavy strides. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he moved to stand directly behind my chair. I felt the sudden shift in the air before I felt him. Then a massive, meaty hand clamped down hard on my left shoulder. His grip was entirely unforgiving, his thick fingers digging painfully into the coarse wool of my coat and the muscle beneath it. He applied a sharp downward pressure, attempting to physically force me back down into my dining chair. It was an unmistakable assertion of physical dominance, a violent demand for immediate submission. "Sit back down right now, lady," the man growled, his voice a low, gravelly threat right next to my ear. "You are causing way too much trouble. Just do what the kid says and hand over the phone." The moment his calloused hand touched my shoulder, the entire atmosphere of the room fundamentally altered. We were no longer engaging in a bitter family dispute over debt and forged signatures. We were no longer arguing about gambling losses or underwater mortgages. The instant he laid hands on me to restrict my movement and force compliance, the invisible line was completely obliterated. The situation shifted instantly from a domestic financial argument into a high-stakes legal thriller. Beatrice gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with genuine fear at the sudden escalation of physical violence. Andre sat completely frozen, his legal mind screaming at the sheer undeniable criminality of what was unfolding in front of him. As a corporate lawyer, Andre knew that this constituted battery and false imprisonment, yet he was too cowardly to utter a single word. Richard finally looked up, his eyes widening as he watched a hired thug lay hands on his wife. Yet true to his spineless nature, Richard did not move a single muscle to intervene. Brandon stood on the opposite side of the ruined table, panting heavily, wine dripping from his cashmere sweater. A triumphant, malicious gleam returned to his eyes. He thought the introduction of raw physical force had finally tipped the scales back in his favor. He thought I was about to break. I did not struggle against the heavy grip on my shoulder. I did not try to pull away, and I absolutely did not cry out for help. Panic is the reaction of a victim, and I was entirely in control of this room. I slowly turned my head just enough to look over my left shoulder. I did not look at the thug's face. I simply looked at the massive heavy hand pressing down on my coat. Then I shifted my gaze back to Brandon, my eyes perfectly flat and devoid of any human warmth. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds. I let the man keep his hand firmly planted on my shoulder, establishing the undeniable physical contact necessary to satisfy the statutory requirements of the law. When I finally spoke, my voice was not loud. It was a deadly, icy whisper that sliced through the tension in the dining room with absolute terrifying clarity. "Remove your hand from my shoulder." Under Title 18, United States Code Section 111, physically assaulting, resisting, or impeding a federal official in the performance of their duties carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. And I am not in a forgiving mood. The hired muscle froze completely. The sheer unyielding authority in my voice hit him much harder than any physical blow ever could. He was not a legal scholar, and he likely had no idea what specific statutes govern the federal justice system, but men who operate in the violent, shadowy margins of society possess highly tuned survival instincts. He knew exactly what the words federal penitentiary meant. He recognized the absolute chilling certainty of someone who held the power to put him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. Very slowly, as if he were disarming a live explosive, the massive man lifted his calloused hand off my shoulder. He took a deliberate, heavy step backward, putting a safe distance between us. He looked at Brandon with an expression of pure, betrayed panic. He had been paid to intimidate a helpless housewife, not to assault a federal official. He raised both of his hands in the air, a universal gesture of surrender, and backed away until he bumped against the locked double doors. He wanted absolutely no part of whatever was about to happen next. Brandon watched his hired thug retreat in absolute disbelief. The last remaining pillar of his aggressive physical ambush had just crumbled into dust, his face twisted into a mask of pure desperate rage. He leaned heavily over the ruined mahogany table, ignoring the dark red wine soaking into the sleeves of his expensive cashmere sweater. "You are completely insane!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking violently in the freezing air of the dining room. "You are literally making up random laws to try and scare us. You are not a federal anything. You are a broke, unemployed loser who leeches off my father." You do not have a job. You do not have any power. You are just a crazy woman wearing a garbage coat trying to buy time because you know you are trapped. Beatrice nodded frantically from the other side of the table. Her diamond tennis bracelet clinked against the wood as she gripped the edge of her chair. She is completely delusional, Beatrice cried out desperately, trying to construct a narrative that would save her wealthy, privileged reality. Richard, look at her. She has completely lost her mind. She is having a total psychological breakdown right in front of us. Richard remained perfectly still at the head of the table. He did not agree with his sister, and he did not defend his son. He was staring at me with a look of dawning, horrifying realization. He had spent 3 years underestimating my intelligence, assuming my quiet demeanor was a sign of weakness. But as he watched me dismantle his son's threats without raising my voice a single decibel, Richard finally began to understand the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. I did not respond to Brandon's screaming. I did not acknowledge Beatrice and her frantic, pathetic attempts to label me as hysterical. I maintained my perfect upright posture in the dining chair. I slowly reached my right hand deep into the inner pocket of my frayed, oversized wool coat. Brandon flinched, taking a quick, involuntary step back from the table. For a split second, he genuinely thought I was reaching for a weapon. He thought the quiet woman he had backed into a corner was finally going to lash out violently. He braced himself, his eyes wide with sudden sharp terror. My fingers brushed against the smooth, familiar texture of solid black leather. I wrapped my hand around it and pulled it out of my pocket in one fluid, deliberate motion. I held the leather wallet in my hand for a brief moment, letting everyone at the table see it. It was not a designer purse. It was not a weapon. It was a simple, unassuming bifold case. Then with a quick flick of my wrist, I flipped the wallet open. The brilliant light from the extravagant crystal chandelier above us caught the polished metal immediately. A heavy, solid gold shield shone brightly against the dark leather. The majestic eagle of the United States government was stamped proudly into the center of the seal, framed by deep blue enamel lettering. Right beneath the heavy gold badge sat my official federal identification card, complete with my photograph, my government credential number, and my authorized signature. I did not pass the open wallet to Brandon. A 24-year-old degenerate gambler would not fully comprehend the vast, devastating weight of the institution that badge represented. I did not pass it to Beatrice, who only understood the superficial value of country club memberships and designer jewelry. I did not even pass it to Richard, the man who had brought me into this house under the delusion that he was my savior. I reached across the gravy-stained tablecloth and slid the open leather wallet directly toward Andre. As an ambitious African-American corporate attorney who navigated the highest echelons of the legal system, Andre was the only person in the room who possessed the education and the professional experience to truly grasp what was sitting in front of him. Andre knew the difference between a cheap novelty prop and authentic federal credentials. He knew the immense sweeping jurisdiction of the people who carried that specific gold shield. Andre stared at the badge as if a live grenade had just been rolled across his dinner plate. All the color drained rapidly from his face. His dark eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. He did not want to touch it. He wanted to push his chair back, run out of the dining room, and pretend he had never set foot inside this house. But the legal reality of the situation pinned him firmly to his seat. "Read it, Andre," I commanded, my voice stripping away any remaining pretense of family diplomacy. "Read it out loud so your nephew understands exactly who he just tried to falsely imprison." Andre's hands were shaking violently as he reached out. His perfectly manicured fingers trembled against the dark leather. He picked up the wallet, bringing it closer to his face to examine the security holograms embedded in the identification card. He looked at my photograph, then at the gold seal, and finally up at me. His arrogance was entirely incinerated. He was a man staring directly into the abyss of his own professional destruction. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the dead silence of the room. He opened his mouth, but his voice failed him on the first attempt. He took a ragged breath and forced the words out. The Honorable Catherine Andre read, his deep courtroom voice reduced to a frail, trembling whisper. Administrative Law Judge, United States Federal Court. Andre dropped the leather wallet onto the mahogany table as if the gold badge had physically burned his fingers. The heavy wallet landed with a solid thud, right next to the torn pieces of the fraudulent post-nuptial agreement he had drafted. He slumped back into his expensive chair, totally defeated. Andre slumped back into his expensive leather chair, completely defeated. The gold badge sitting on the table between us was the ultimate indisputable proof of his profound ignorance. He stared at it, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The brilliant corporate attorney was entirely paralyzed, unable to look away from the federal seal that had just obliterated his entire career trajectory. Richard remained perfectly still at the head of the table. He sat there like a statue carved out of ice, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He could not comprehend what had just happened. The woman he had spent the last 3 years belittling, the woman he had just tried to force out onto the freezing streets with a pathetic $5,000 check, was a federal judge. I stood up slowly. My movement commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the grand dining room. I reached for the large chipped plastic button on the front of my frayed wool coat. I unfastened it, slipping my arms out of the heavy, itchy fabric. I let the oversized garment slide off my shoulders and drop carelessly onto the back of my empty dining chair. Underneath that hideous thrift store coat, I was not wearing cheap, worn-out clothes. I was wearing a sleek, custom-tailored, deep emerald green designer dress. The fabric was immaculate, the cut razor-sharp, projecting the kind of quiet, absolute authority that money alone cannot buy. I looked directly at Richard. I watched his bloodshot eyes travel from the discarded coat to my dress, his brain completely short-circuiting as the illusion he had built around me shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "You told this entire room that you rescued me, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the dining room. "You claimed you pulled me out of a pathetic, cramped little life and gave me a luxury roof over my head. You were so incredibly eager to play the wealthy savior that you never once stopped to ask yourself why a woman in her 30s was living completely off the grid." Richard opened his mouth, but his throat was too dry to form any words. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of shock and profound regret. "I did not come to you because I was destitute." I continued, taking a slow, measured step toward the head of the table. "I came to you because I was exhausted. I was the youngest administrative law judge ever appointed to my district. I spent 4 years presiding over a massive, highly dangerous cartel money laundering case. I put violent, ruthless men behind bars, and it took a very heavy toll on my life. When the trial finally concluded, the federal government placed me under a high-level security protection program. I was offered an early, highly lucrative retirement package to ensure my physical safety." Beatrice gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. The idea that she had just spent an hour mocking a woman who had taken down a criminal cartel was finally penetrating her shallow, status-obsessed mind. "I wanted a boring, quiet suburban life," I said, keeping my gaze locked on my husband. "You offered me exactly that. I played the role of the quiet, unassuming wife because I wanted peace. I wanted to fade into the background. But you mistook my desire for a quiet life as a lack of ambition. You mistook my silence for stupidity. You thought because I did not brag about my bank account at your country club dinners I must not have one." I paused, ensuring everyone at the table was hanging on my every word. "I receive a full federal pension," I stated, laying out the exact financial reality they had completely ignored. "On top of that, I maintain a private, highly classified consulting retainer for a global security firm. I bring in $36,000 a month, Richard, every single month." Brandon let out a strangled, pathetic gasp from across the room. $36,000 a month was more than he had blown in his entire sports betting spree, and it was entering my bank account every 30 days. His eyes darted wildly from me to his father, realizing the monumental fortune they had actively tried to throw away tonight. "This coat?" I asked, gesturing gracefully toward the ugly, stained garment draped over my chair. "I bought it at a local Goodwill yesterday for $12. I wore it tonight for one very specific reason. I wanted to see exactly how fast you would throw me to the wolves when you thought I was completely broke. I wanted to see what you would do when you believed I had absolutely zero economic value to offer you. And you did not disappoint me, Richard. You showed me exactly who you are." Beatrice was physically shaking. Her entire worldview, which was entirely dependent on wealth and social hierarchy, had just been flipped completely upside down. She had mocked me, insulted me, and treated me like a peasant. Now she was staring at a woman who possessed more wealth and institutional power than her entire family combined. Beatrice gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bright white. "But the debt," Beatrice stammered, her voice high and trembling with absolute confusion. "The house is in foreclosure. If you have all that money, why did you not pay the mortgage? Why are we losing the house tonight? I stopped pacing. I turned to look directly at Beatrice, offering her a slow, predatory smile that made her flinch backward in her chair. Let us talk about Apex Holdings. Beatrice flinched backward in her chair, as if the words themselves possessed a physical weight. The name Apex Holdings hung in the freezing air of the dining room, a dark, heavy cloud that had just blocked out whatever tiny ray of hope this family was desperately clinging to. Richard looked up at me, his face glistening with a cold sweat, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was trying to connect the dots, but his arrogant, fragile mind was simply refusing to accept the catastrophic reality standing right in front of him. I began to walk slowly down the length of the mahogany table, my emerald green designer dress, moving flawlessly with each step. I was no longer the quiet, discarded wife shrinking away in a corner. I commanded every square inch of this space. The hired muscle by the door watched me with wide eyes completely frozen, realizing he was currently trespassing on property owned by a federal official. When the federal government structured my early retirement package, I needed a discreet, highly secure vehicle to manage the incoming funds, I explained, keeping my voice smooth, conversational, and utterly terrifying. A standard savings account is entirely insufficient for a federal pension combined with a massive ongoing security retainer. So I established a private equity firm, a limited liability company specifically designed to manage substantial high-yield investments with absolute ironclad anonymity. I named it Apex Holdings. Andre let out a strangled gasp. He gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned a harsh, stark white. The brilliant corporate attorney finally understood the full, devastating scope of the trap his brother-in-law had walked into. You bought the debt, Andre whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of professional awe and profound personal horror. You did not just let the bank foreclose, you actually bought his commercial loan. I stopped walking. I stood directly between Richard and Brandon, looking down at the two men who had spent the entire evening treating me like disposable trash. I am a former federal judge, Andre, I replied, not breaking my gaze away from my husband. I do not rely on hope, and I absolutely do not leave my financial security in the hands of a commercial lending institution. I looked closely at Richard. He was shaking. The man who had proudly ordered me to sign away my legal rights was currently vibrating with pure, unadulterated terror. The veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief. It started about 8 months ago, I said, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the silent room. I started noticing the small, careless discrepancies, a few $1,000s missing from our joint checking account, unexplained withdrawals from the emergency savings. I saw the frantic, panicked way you rushed to the mailbox every afternoon, Richard. I noticed the aggressive, persistent phone calls from unknown numbers that you would only answer behind the locked door of your private study. Beatrice let out a soft, pathetic sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. She could not bear to listen, but she was entirely paralyzed, unable to look away from the complete dismantling of her brother's life. The pristine social image she so desperately craved was entirely built on Richard's wealth, and she was watching that wealth evaporate in real time. Most wives would have confronted you. I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, merciless register. Most women would have cried, screamed, demanded answers, and begged you to go to couples counseling. They would have pleaded with you to stop destroying your financial future. They would have tried to save you from your own reckless, arrogant stupidity. But I am not most women. I took a deliberate step closer to Richard, forcing him to look up at me. When I saw Richard stealing from our joint accounts to pay Brandon's bookies, I did not cry. I bought your debt through my LLC. The words hit the dining room with the explosive force of a detonating bomb. Brandon let out a loud, pathetic whimper, backing away until his spine hit the heavy velvet drapes covering the windows. He looked at his father with absolute disgust, finally realizing that Richard had not just failed to secure the money, but had actively handed the key to their entire existence over to the very woman they were trying to evict. The gambling syndicate was going to tear Brandon apart, and he had no shield left to hide behind. You see, Richard, I explained, leaning down just slightly so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. When a bank realizes a high-risk commercial loan is severely underwater, they do not want to deal with the messy, drawn-out process of a public foreclosure. They want to offload the toxic asset as quickly and quietly as possible to recoup their losses. When my wealth manager contacted them through Apex Holdings and offered to purchase the defaulted paper on this estate for a lump sum of clean, untraceable cash, the bank approved the transfer in less than 48 hours. Andre buried his face in his hands. He knew the legal reality of what I had just described. By purchasing the debt through a corporate entity, I had entirely bypassed the marital property laws. The loan was not a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. It was a commercial transaction between a private equity firm and a defaulting debtor. I had legally isolated the property from the marriage before Richard even knew what was happening. "You planned this." Richard choked out his voice, barely a raw, scraping whisper. "You sat there for months watching me panic, watching me try to save this family, and you just let me drown." I straightened my posture, looking down at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You were not trying to save this family, Richard. You were trying to save your own fragile ego. You forged my signature on a federal bank document. You brought a hired thug into this house to terrorize me into signing a fraudulent contract. You tried to throw me out into the freezing snow with a pathetic $5,000 check. You did all of this because you believed you were untouchable, and you believed I was completely powerless." I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing the crushing weight of his absolute failure to press down firmly on his chest. "I don't just live in this house, Richard," I said. "I am your sole creditor. I own the roof over your head, the car in the driveway, and the ground you are standing on." Andre staggered backward as if I had struck him across the jaw with a baseball bat. The arrogant, high-powered corporate attorney who had mocked my coat and my worth just an hour ago was now hyperventilating. His expensive Tom Ford suit suddenly looked suffocating. He raised his hands, palms facing outward in a desperate, universally recognized gesture of surrender. He tried to backpedal his deep voice, losing every ounce of its practiced courtroom authority. "Catherine, listen to me. I had absolutely no idea. Richard came to me as a client. He told me this was a standard asset protection measure for the family estate. I did not know the property was in commercial default, and I swear to you, I did not know Brandon hired a thug to lock those doors." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You are lying, Andre. You sat at this table and watched that man block the exit. You watched Brandon physically threaten me, and instead of stopping it, you used it. You used the threat of violence and imminent financial ruin to try and extort my signature. You are not a victim of your brother-in-law's deception. You are an active co-conspirator." "No," Andre pleaded, his hands shaking violently. "I was retained to draft a document, that is all. I cannot be held responsible for what they do outside the scope of my legal counsel." "Do not insult my intelligence," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. "You drafted a post-nuptial agreement that explicitly waived my right to equitable distribution while intentionally concealing the true state of the marital assets. That is fraud. You attempted to execute that document under extreme, undeniable duress. That is extortion. You are a licensed attorney in this state, and you sat at a dining table and actively facilitated a felony." Andre was sweating profusely now. He looked at his wife for help, but Beatrice was curled in her chair, weeping silently into her hands, completely useless to him. "You violated the most fundamental ethical obligations of our profession." I continued, making sure every word struck him with maximum impact. Rule 8.4 of the Rules of Professional Conduct strictly prohibits a lawyer from engaging in conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. You crossed that line the moment you slid that envelope across this table. "I will withdraw the document," Andre stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the torn pieces on the gravy-stained tablecloth. "I will shred it. It never existed. We can just pretend this never happened, Catherine. Please. I have worked my entire life to build my firm. I will pay you. I will write you a check right now to cover whatever Richard owes Apex Holdings. Just let this go." I looked at him with absolute, unyielding disgust. "You think you can bribe a former federal judge in front of multiple witnesses, Andre? You just keep digging your own grave deeper." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again. When Brandon emailed me the digital draft of this contract yesterday afternoon, demanding I review it before dinner, he made a catastrophic mistake. He sent me the original Word document, not a flattened PDF file, which means he sent me all the embedded metadata. Andre's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. As a corporate lawyer, he knew exactly what metadata contained. I saw the creation tags I stated clearly. I saw the revision history. I saw the timestamps showing exactly when you edited the severability clause to make it as predatory as possible. And I saw your digital signature baked right into the author properties of the file. What did you do? Andre whispered, pure terror completely paralyzing his vocal cords. I did what any sworn officer of the court is obligated to do when presented with clear evidence of professional misconduct, I replied. Before I even put on this thrift store coat to come to dinner tonight, I forwarded the entire digital file along with a formal complaint detailing the coercive circumstances of its execution directly to the State Bar Disciplinary Committee. Andre let out a sound that was less of a gasp and more of a dying wheeze. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep himself from collapsing. They will open an investigation by Monday morning, I said, delivering the final crushing blow. They will subpoena your emails. They will audit your firm's billing records for Richard's accounts. They will see that you conspired to defraud a spouse to protect a commercial asset that was already in federal default. Your career is over, Andre. You are going to be disbarred. The realization hit Andre with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. The prestigious life he had built, the massive corporate income, the social status, the platinum Rolex on his wrist, it was all gone. And it was gone because he had decided to play the bully for his corrupt brother-in-law. Andre slowly turned his head. He looked at Richard, who was still sitting at the head of the table, entirely broken. Then he looked at Brandon, who was cowering against the window drapes. The last shred of family loyalty evaporated instantly. The united, arrogant front that had tried to destroy me completely shattered. You ruined my life, Andre screamed. The booming, authoritative voice he had used to threaten me earlier was now weaponized entirely against his own family. He lunged toward Richard, pointing a furious, trembling finger right in his face. You lied to me, Richard. You dragged me into your pathetic, degenerate gambling mess, and you ruined my life. Richard shrank back in his chair, raising his hands weakly. Andre, I swear I thought I could fix it. I thought Katie would just sign the papers and go. You thought, Andre roared, his face twisted with pure, unrestrained rage. You are an absolute moron. You committed bank fraud. You tried to extort a federal judge, and you dragged me down with you. I am going to lose my license because of your useless gambling addict son. Brandon stepped forward, his fists clenched, trying to defend himself. Do not blame this on me, Andre. You are the one who wrote the contract. You said it was airtight. I wrote a contract based on the lies your father fed me. Andre shouted, turning his wrath on the 24-year-old. You are nothing, Brandon. You are a spoiled, pathetic loser who owes money to dangerous criminals, and you just destroyed everyone in this room because you are too stupid to get a real job. Beatrice finally snapped. She jumped out of her chair, her diamond bracelet flashing as she grabbed her husband's arm. Stop it, Andre. Stop yelling at my nephew. This is her fault. She pointed a desperate, shaking finger at me. She is doing this to us. Andre violently ripped his arm away from his wife's grasp. Shut up, Beatrice. Just shut your mouth. You have been sitting here cheering them on all night. You are just as guilty. We are all going down for this, and it is entirely because of your corrupt, idiotic brother. Andre's booming voice continued to echo off the vaulted ceiling, his furious accusations entirely shattering whatever fragile bonds of family loyalty remained in the room. He pointed a trembling finger at Brandon, calling him a pathetic liability who had just dragged them all into a federal indictment. Beatrice was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her diamond necklace as if it could somehow shield her from the impending bankruptcy and public humiliation. Richard remained slumped in his chair at the head of the table, staring vacantly at the spilled red wine soaking into the white linen. Brandon watched his arrogant, high-powered uncle completely unravel. The 24-year-old finally understood that there was no secret legal loophole, no clever corporate maneuver, and absolutely no hidden cash to save him. His father was utterly broke. The estate belonged to me. The fake post-nuptial agreement was a piece of trash that was currently being investigated by the State Disciplinary Committee. And worst of all, the violent gambling syndicate was still expecting their $200,000 by the end of the week. The sheer crushing reality of his situation hit Brandon like a physical blow. His face went chalk white and his breathing became rapid and shallow. The smug, entitled heir, who had proudly ordered me to sign away my life, was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, cowardly boy who realized he was about to face the devastating consequences of his own actions. I am not staying here. Brandon gasped, his voice cracking wildly as he backed away from the ruined dining table. I am not going down for this. You are the one who forged the bank documents, Dad. You are the one who messed up the mortgage. I just wanted my money. I am leaving. I am getting out of this house right now. Brandon turned his back on his father and sprinted toward the heavy oak double doors leading to the main foyer. The hired muscle, the large man who had spent the evening playing the role of an intimidating notary, was already one step ahead of him. The giant thug had watched the gold federal badge hit the table, and he had heard the terrifying recitation of federal assault statutes. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the catastrophe unfolding in the dining room. He did not wait for Brandon to pay him his untraceable cash fee. He backed away from the main exit, abandoning his post entirely, and shoved his way forcefully through the swinging doors that led into the kitchen. He was trying to slip out the back service entrance and vanish into the freezing winter night before anyone asked for his name. Brandon reached the grand double doors and grabbed the polished brass handles. His hands were shaking so violently that he struggled to grip the metal. He fumbled frantically with the heavy deadbolt, twisting the lock back and forth in a blind, desperate panic to escape the room he had so proudly locked me inside just an hour earlier. I watched him struggle with the door. I did not move to stop him. I simply reached my hand into the hidden side pocket of my custom-tailored emerald green dress, my fingers wrapped around a small, unassuming device. It was not much larger than a car key fob constructed of durable black matte plastic with a single deeply recessed red button in the center. It was a device issued exclusively to federal officials operating under high-level security protection protocols. "You can stop pulling at the door handle, Brandon," I said, my voice projecting across the room with a calm, chilling authority that made him freeze instantly. "Even if you manage to unlock it, you are not going anywhere." Brandon slowly turned his head to look at me over his shoulder. His chest was heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, hunted look. "What are you talking about?" Brandon stammered, his grip still tight on the brass handle. "I am leaving. You cannot keep me here." I pulled my hand out of my pocket and held up the small black device for everyone in the room to see. The tiny red light on the top of the fob was blinking in a steady, rhythmic pulse. "When you preside over federal cases involving violent cartels and organized crime syndicates, the government does not just hand you a pension and send you on your way," I explained, keeping my tone highly clinical and educational. "They take your physical safety extremely seriously. They provide you with a direct, encrypted emergency line to the United States Marshals Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I let the silence settle over the room, watching the blood completely drain from Beatrice and Andre's faces as they realized exactly what I was holding. "I pressed this button the exact second your hired thug turned the deadbolt on those doors," I said, staring directly into Brandon's terrified eyes. Brandon let go of the door handle. He took a stumbling step backward, his legs suddenly struggling to support his weight. "You called the cops," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly the words barely registered. "I did not call the local police to report a domestic disturbance, Brandon," I corrected him, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. "I triggered a federal distress signal. When a protected judge signals that they have been physically trapped against their will, the response is not a casual welfare check. It is an immediate, overwhelming tactical deployment." I took a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to absorb the absolute magnitude of the crime he had just committed. "You thought it was a clever, intimidating prank to lock your stepmother in a dining room until she surrendered her bank accounts. But you did not lock in a housewife. You unlawfully confined a federal official. False imprisonment of a protected judge is a severe federal offense, Brandon. The FBI does not take it lightly, and they do not ask politely when they arrive to extract their personnel." Richard finally let out a raw, anguished sob from the head of the table. He buried his face in his hands, fully comprehending that his son was not just facing gambling debts, but decades in a federal penitentiary. Andre closed his eyes, leaning his head back against his expensive leather chair, completely surrendering to the inevitable destruction of his family. "You did this," Brandon cried out, pointing a shaking finger at me, tears of pure panic spilling down his cheeks. "You set us up. You let us lock the doors so you could trap us." I offered him a cold, razor-sharp smile. "I did not force you to hire a thug, Brandon. I did not force you to try and extort me. I simply handed you the rope and you eagerly wrapped it around your own neck. You locked me in. I just made sure you could not get out." Right on cue, the piercing, unmistakable shriek of multiple high-powered sirens shattered the quiet winter night outside. The sound grew deafeningly loud, echoing through the sprawling estate as numerous heavy vehicles tore up the long, winding driveway. Brilliant, intense flashes of red and blue light pierced violently through the gaps in the heavy velvet drapes. The strobe lights swept across the grand dining room, casting long, frantic shadows against the vaulted ceiling and the ruined mahogany table. The vibrant, flashing colors illuminated the utterly terrified, broken faces of the family who had thought they were entirely above the law. The consequences of their arrogance had finally arrived at their front door. The flashing red and blue lights completely flooded the dining room, casting wild, rotating shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Before anyone in the family could even take a single breath to process what was happening, the heavy oak double doors leading to the grand foyer burst open with explosive, terrifying force. Local police officers flooded into the room, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the lavish holiday decor. But they were not alone. Moving with absolute silent precision were 4 federal agents wearing tactical vests, emblazoned with bold yellow letters. They did not knock. They did not politely ask for permission to enter the premises. When a distress signal from a protected federal judge is triggered, law enforcement treats the location as a highly volatile active hostage situation. The hired muscle, the massive thug who had spent the evening playing the role of an intimidating notary, was already halfway through the swinging doors leading into the kitchen. He thought he could use his size to slip out the back service entrance and vanish into the winter night. He made a catastrophic miscalculation. The moment his heavy boots hit the kitchen tile, the back doors were violently kicked open by 2 more federal agents who had already secured the perimeter of the estate. The giant man did not even have the chance to raise his hands. An agent grabbed him by the collar of his cheap suit, spun him around with staggering force, and slammed him face first against the custom marble countertops. The sound of his skull hitting the stone echoed sharply. Within 5 seconds, the man who had laid a threatening hand on my shoulder was pinned aggressively to the ground, his arms twisted behind his back and tightly secured with heavy-duty zip ties. Back in the dining room, absolute pandemonium had taken over. Brandon, the arrogant 24-year-old heir, who had proudly ordered me to sign away my life just an hour ago, completely and utterly broke. The sight of armed federal agents storming into his father's house shattered whatever fragile, entitled bravado he had left. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor right next to the shattered crystal wine glasses and the spilled Cabernet. He did not try to fight. He did not try to argue the legal merits of his fraudulent contract. He curled his knees up toward his chest and began to cry. It was not a quiet, dignified weeping. It was the loud, gasping, hysterical sobbing of a terrified child who suddenly realized he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. "Please!" Brandon wailed, his voice cracking violently as 2 officers approached him. "Please do not arrest me. It was just a piece of paper. We were just trying to get some money. I did not mean to hurt anyone, I promise." The officers did not show a single ounce of sympathy. They grabbed Brandon by his cashmere sweater, hauled him roughly to his feet, and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the loudest sound in the room. Brandon squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing so hard he could barely stand, his entire body trembling as they read him his rights. In the far corner of the dining room, Beatrice had backed herself entirely into the heavy velvet window drapes. She was hyperventilating, taking short, ragged, panicked breaths. Her manicured hands were clutching her diamond necklace so tightly that the expensive jewels were digging into her skin. The pristine, wealthy socialite was watching her family being dismantled by federal authorities, and her brain simply could not process the trauma. She sank slowly down the wall, curling into a tight ball on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. Andre, however, was desperately trying to salvage the rapidly disintegrating situation. The brilliant African-American corporate lawyer refused to accept that his elite status meant absolutely nothing in this room. He aggressively straightened his custom Tom Ford suit, puffed out his chest, and marched directly toward the lead federal agent coordinating the arrests. "Excuse me, officer," Andre demanded, projecting his deep, booming courtroom voice, as if he were addressing a subordinate clerk. "I need you to halt this operation immediately. There has been a profound misunderstanding here tonight. I am a licensed corporate attorney, and these people are my family. This is a private domestic financial dispute that got slightly out of hand. No federal crimes have been committed." Andre reached confidently into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. He thrust it toward the agent, fully expecting the man to read his prestigious credentials, apologize for the intrusion, and back down. The federal agent did not even look at the business card. He did not look at Andre's platinum Rolex or his expensive shoes. The agent simply raised his hand, placing a firm, unyielding palm squarely against Andre's chest, physically stopping the lawyer from taking another step forward. "Step back right now, sir." The agent ordered, his voice completely devoid of any respect for Andre's wealth or title. "You are interfering with an active federal investigation. If you speak to me again, or if you take one more step toward this scene, you will be placed in handcuffs for obstructing justice. Stand against the wall and keep your mouth shut." Andre stood frozen, his arms still outstretched, holding the useless business card. For the first time in his entire life, his aggressive legal intimidation tactics had failed completely. He was not the smartest or the most powerful man in the room. He was just another suspect in a federal crime scene. He slowly lowered his hand, his face draining of all color, and backed away against the wall exactly as he was ordered. The dining room was a scene of absolute devastation. The hired thug was neutralized in the kitchen. Brandon was sobbing in handcuffs. Beatrice was having a panic attack on the floor, and Andre had been completely silenced by federal authority, which left only one person. Richard stood at the head of the ruined mahogany table. The man who had mocked my frayed coat, who had told me I brought zero economic value to his life, who had tried to throw me out into the freezing snow to cover up his own gambling debts, was entirely out of options. He watched his son being dragged away by the police. He watched his powerful brother-in-law get humiliated by an agent. He knew the bank fraud investigators would be knocking on his door by morning. He realized he had absolutely no power left. His only chance for survival was the woman he had spent the last 3 years underestimating. Richard slowly stepped away from the table. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and brimming with desperate, pathetic tears. He looked at me, taking in my impeccable posture, my custom-tailored emerald green dress, and the complete lack of mercy in my eyes. His legs buckled. Richard fell heavily to his knees right in front of me. The loud thud of his kneecaps hitting the hardwood floor echoed through the room. He reached his shaking hands out and grabbed the hem of my designer dress, clinging to the expensive fabric, as if it were a life raft in a violent storm. He looked up at me, his handsome face twisted into an expression of pure, agonizing desperation. "Katie, please," Richard begged, his voice a raw, scraping sob that echoed pathetically across the dining room. "Please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it was all a mistake. I am your husband. I love you. I never wanted any of this to happen. It was Brandon. It was Brandon's idea, all of it. He forced me to go along with it to save his life. I would never hurt you, Katie. Please, I am begging you. Do not let them take me." I looked down at Richard, watching him cling to the hem of my designer dress. Like a terrified, pathetic child, the grand, arrogant patriarch who had spent the entire evening ordering me to surrender my life and my dignity was now weeping on his knees, surrounded by armed federal agents. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, and his expensive suit jacket was stained with the red wine his own son had violently spilled. He was completely broken, utterly stripped of the wealth and the power he had used to terrorize people for years. "Katie, please!" Richard sobbed, his voice raw and scraping against the chaotic noise of the dining room. "Please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it was all a mistake. I am your husband. I love you. I never wanted any of this to happen. It was Brandon. It was Brandon's idea, all of it. He forced me to go along with it to save his life. I would never hurt you, Katie. Please, I am begging you. Do not let them take me." I did not step back. I did not try to pull my dress out of his frantic, trembling grasp. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man I had shared a home with for 3 years. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity. No residual affection. Just a cold, unyielding clarity. I looked over at Brandon, who was being hauled to his feet by 2 police officers. He heard his father's desperate confession, heard Richard throw him entirely under the bus in a pathetic attempt to save his own skin. Brandon let out a strangled cry of pure betrayal, struggling weakly against the steel handcuffs cutting into his wrists. "Dad, you coward!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking violently. "You are the one who forged the bank documents. You are the one who stole the mortgage money to gamble. You set me up." The lead federal agent stepped forward, placing a firm, heavy hand on Richard's shoulder. "Sir, let go of the judge," the agent ordered, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit false imprisonment and federal bank fraud. Stand up and put your hands behind your back." Richard ignored the agent, He squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his flushed face, and clung tighter to my dress. "Katie, tell him," Richard pleaded, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "Tell him I am your husband. Tell him we can fix this." I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off the emerald green fabric of my dress. I did not use anger. I did not raise my voice. I delivered my final judgment with the exact surgical precision I had used in my courtroom for years. "You told me to sign that contract tonight because I brought no economic value to this family," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the sounds of the police securing the room. "You looked me in the eye and you told me I was a useless dependent who deserved to be thrown out into the freezing snow with nothing but $5,000. Richard stared up at me, his face twisting in absolute agony, as his own cruel words were weaponized directly against him. "You were right about one thing, Richard." I continued, my gaze flat and devoid of any mercy. "I do not belong here. I do not belong in a house built on fraud, surrounded by people who view cruelty as a casual dinner party game." The federal agent grabbed Richard by the arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet. Richard did not try to fight. He went completely limp, sobbing openly, as the officer quickly and efficiently cuffed his hands behind his back. I looked at Andre, who was still standing silently against the wall, watching his brother-in-law being arrested. The corporate attorney looked completely sick, realizing his entire prestigious career was effectively over. I looked at Beatrice, who was still curled in a tight ball on the hardwood floor, weeping into her diamond necklace, mourning the total destruction of her wealthy social image. I turned my attention to the lead federal agent, who was currently reading Richard his Miranda rights officer. I said, my voice ringing with undeniable official authority. "I want these individuals removed from my property immediately. Keep them all in federal holding overnight." Richard let out a devastated, pathetic wail as the officers began to drag him forcefully toward the grand double doors. Brandon was already being pushed out into the freezing winter night, his head bowed in absolute defeat. "I'll be pressing full charges in the morning," I added, watching the doors swing shut behind them. The heavy oak double doors swung shut, cutting off the frantic, desperate sounds of my husband and his son being hauled away in handcuffs. The pulsating red and blue lights of the police cruisers gradually faded as the convoy of law enforcement vehicles rolled down the long, winding driveway, carrying away the remnants of a thoroughly shattered family. In their wake, an absolute profound silence settled over the grand estate. It was a silence entirely devoid of the toxic arrogance and suffocating tension that had poisoned this home for the last 3 years. I stood alone in the center of the massive dining room, breathing in the cold air, completely undisturbed by the winter chill. I looked around at the devastating aftermath of their failed ambush. The imported winter roses of the floral centerpiece were crushed